Hi, I'm Jennifer Ledford, and I am excited to talk at you guys for the next few minutes and with you guys this week about single case design. I'll start with a brief intro for those of you who don't know me. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University in the Early Childhood Special Education and Applied Behavior Analysis programs. I'm interested in single case design, obviously, and instructional methods for children, especially those with disabilities. I'm increasingly interested in improving the pivotal skills of engagement and imitation for young children. I am from Georgia and I got my PhD at Vanderbilt in 2012. The dog is there just for cuteness value. Her name is Harper, and I got married on New Year's Day this year. So those are some fun facts about me. This slide shows just a quick overview of what we will discuss each day. On each day, there will be one video which covers basic content and another which covers intermediate or advanced content. If you're a beginner, you'll have 8 total videos, but I'm hoping to keep them at around 15 minutes each. Before we get started, it will be important that you understand what we're talking about in terms of just basic research terms. So the independent variable can be thought of as the intervention, the thing that we manipulate, the behaviors that we engage in, that we hope to change the behaviors of children or adults. The dependent variable can be thought of as the target behavior or the outcome. So I'll use those terms assuming that you know what they mean. Single case research, when designed and implemented correctly, can help us establish causal links or relations between independent and dependent variables. That is, when we use them, we can say that the IV, or the independent variable, caused the change in the DV, or dependent variable, and we refer to this as a functional relation. So there are 3 things that really establish single case as single case. The first is repeated measurement. Generally, we measure the same thing over and over again, sometimes as little as 10 times, but often as many as 30 or 100. Because of this, we can't use some measures that are typical in group design research, like standardized assessments. But we can use measures that are really sensitive to behavior change, which is good, especially for children whose behaviors might change subtly. So for example, children with severe disabilities. So for example, if we implemented a peer-mediated intervention for a 2-year-old with severe ID, we wouldn't necessarily expect large changes in overall social competence measured via a normative test, but we might expect that their number of interactions during free play would increase, and that can be a big deal too. The second characteristic of single case is that the behavior of a single case, usually one person, is compared to the behavior of that case or person under different conditions. This is in comparison to typical group designs like RCTs, where the average behavior of many people in one group is compared to the average behavior of many people in another group. And so I said single case is usually one person. In the cases when it's not, it's typically an intact group. So we might measure the behavior of all children in a small group or all children in a classroom and call that a case. But typically, a single case is a single person. Finally, single case research is dependent on careful and controlled condition ordering as the primary way to control for major threats to internal validity. That is, condition ordering is what gives us the basic conditions necessary for identifying functional relations. Just a caveat here, I said necessary, but I didn't say sufficient. Condition ordering is the foundation of single case design, but we'll talk more throughout the week about other necessary conditions for internal validity. Don't worry, I'm going to come back to that term, internal validity, in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about what you might call a defining feature of single case. But for reasons that are sort of too complex to get into for a 15-minute video presentation, I'm not going to call it one of the 3 sort of big defining features. And that is that single case is generally thought of as dynamic. So you may change study procedures as you progress, and I'll talk about that more in the second video today. But to establish a functional relation, you still have to follow the established condition ordering rules. So it's dynamic, but we don't just change things willy-nilly. It's still rule-bound. So it's not a free-for-all. And if you engage in it in that way, you'll get results that aren't very interpretable. So first off, what's this internal validity thing that I've mentioned? Generally, it's the ability to rule out alternative explanations for your results. So a study with high internal validity leaves us with behavior changes that we are confident are related to the variables we manipulated. Studies with low internal validity are those that leave us with results that, even if they're positive, we aren't sure if we can interpret. That is, we don't know if they are positive because of something we purposefully controlled or some other uncontrolled variable. So threats to internal validity are those uncontrolled variables that threaten our ability to draw confident conclusions. I would say that history and maturation are sort of the big two threats, and they're the two that are primarily controlled for via condition ordering. So history is anything that happens outside of the study that results in behavior change. For example, if you start an intervention where you train a parent to engage in responsive interactions with their child, like enhanced value teaching, but the family also enrolls in an intensive early intervention program that includes parent training at the same time, you won't know whether any behavior change that you see is the result of your intervention or the other program or some combination or interaction between the two. Maturation is just what you would expect. It's changes due to the passage of time. It's a threat when you can't separate how much of a child's growth is due to typical change over time that would have happened anyway versus change that's the direct result of your intervention. So I know some of you have limited or no experience with single case, so let's just pause for a second to talk about the data we'll be looking at for the next few days. This screenshot depicts some important parts of the graph. The horizontal axis depicts the passage of time. So the data points are at least ordinal. So that is, the second data point represents behavior that occurred after the first and before the third. Usually this is represented as sessions or days. The vertical axis represents the amount of behavior that's occurring. So data near the bottom represent low occurrence and data near the top represent high occurrence. And we'll talk more tomorrow about how we'll measure that occurrence. And each individual data points represent how much behavior occurred during a specific period of time. So during day 12, the highest levels of behavior occurred, and during day 8, no behavior occurred at all. So just a note about notation, we usually call the first condition A, and that's typically a baseline or a non-intervention condition. And we call the second condition B, and that's typically an intervention condition. So this full design is an AB design. If the second conditions represented different interventions instead of baseline intervention. So here we have a baseline followed by 3 different interventions. This design would be notated as A, B, C, D. So when we have a graph like this, it may be hard to know whether a history effect has occurred. So, excuse me, during baseline, there were 0 or very few intervals during which this preschooler with Down syndrome engaged in interactions with her peers. So across 8 days, the levels were very low. When intervention began, the levels jumped to around 50%. It's great for the kid. But with just these data, I'm not convinced it's the intervention. Maybe something else also happened on that day. The child began to attend an after-school group with one of the peers, and there was a specially skilled facilitator there, for example. Or the child got hearing aids and was better able to communicate with her peers. Or the child started a new medication that alleviated some symptom that was making her not feel well. It could be so many things. This is where condition ordering will help. We'll rule out some of those things. So likewise, with this simple graph, maturation might be the reason for behavior change rather than the actual intervention. It's especially hard to rule out because it looks like there might be some subtle changes over time in baseline. So you'll see that we start at 0 and we might move up just a tiny bit as time goes on in baseline. So we don't know if those changes would have kept happening in intervention and resulted in these increased behaviors. So another quick note, a single case study is a single experiment. So it's the application of an explicated set of procedures for one or more participants. Usually studies are found in a single source, so a single article or a single dissertation document. A design is a single opportunity to demonstrate a functional relation. So most studies include multiple designs. Here's an example of this. This is an article from 2007. It includes 4 participants, and for each participant, there are 2 variables, vocal stereotypy and appropriate vocalizations. So you can see here that there are 8 different designs, or said a different way, 8 opportunities to demonstrate a functional relation, even though it's just one study. So 8 designs and 1 study. Side note, I don't love RIRD and generally don't like treating vocal stereotypy, but this is an example of convenience. There are some other important threats, some of them listed here, and we'll talk about them later in the week. All right, so what are the different types of single case design? Well, first I'll say that the design names aren't really the important thing. It is how we refer to them, but you really need to understand the condition ordering rules and how they work to control for threats to internal validity, and that's more important even than the design names. So I'm going to organize talking about the design names around the different ordering types. The first type of design is sort of the prototype single case design that if someone knows about single case, this is the design they might know about. It's a slow alternation of conditions, sometimes called sequential introduction and withdrawal. In these types, you generally start with a condition without any intervention in effect or baseline. This graph shows that baseline data were collected for the first 8 sessions. Then intervention is introduced for 5 sessions. Then baseline was reintroduced. Excuse me, you can also say that the intervention was withdrawn. Finally, intervention was reintroduced. So if you'll remember, I said this change in play behavior that occurred between sessions 8 and 9 could have been anything, but what's the likelihood that something caused the behavior to change here, also caused it to decrease here, and then caused it to increase again here? Pretty low. And because it's that unlikely, we say we've controlled for history threats. The types of designs that are use slow alternation, kind of the most common, are called ABAB, withdrawal, or reversal designs. The second type of condition ordering is fast alternation, generally referred to as rapid iterative alternation designs. In these designs, instead of implementing one condition for several days and then another for the next several days, you alternate them rapidly. So here for 1 session, researchers implemented a teacher choice condition, then the next session was child choice, and so on. Basic design types using this method are the alternating treatments and multi-element designs. Finally, time lag designs are the most common type of single case design. These designs include multiple baseline and multiple probe designs. The 3 tiers can be 3 different participants, behaviors, or contexts. This graph depicts a multiple baseline design across behaviors. So instead of alternating conditions, we do an A to B intervention implementation across 3 different tiers. In this graph, the tiers are different behaviors that preschool teachers are learning to engage in. So for rule reminders, there are 4 days of baseline. For friendship skills, there are about 10. And for providing choices, there are about 25. Again, this helps control for those history effects. It's very unlikely that an outside event happened at 3 different times for 3 different behaviors that caused behavior to change 3 different times. This graph represents a multiple probe design, which just means that during the baseline conditions, data are collected intermittently instead of continuously, which you'll see based on these gaps in data in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th tiers. This is a multiple probe across participants design. So the first tier is Jeremy's behavior in both baseline and intervention conditions, and then John's, Dan's, and Alex's. And the same logic applies to multiple baseline and multiple probe designs. It's very unlikely that behavior change happened 4 times just by chance. So how do you choose between using a multiple probe design where baseline data are collected intermittently and a multiple baseline design where data are collected continuously? It depends on whether testing threats or instability threats are more likely. Testing threats happen when repeated baseline measurement impacts the accuracy of data. So the most common example is repeatedly having children demonstrate that they cannot successfully complete a task. This might reduce their motivation, which artificially deflates their performance. In this case, that testing threats might be likely, which suggests that you should use a multiple probe design rather than a multiple baseline design to reduce the number of measurement occasions in baseline. On the other hand, if data are likely to be more unstable, so if the data are going to change a lot in level within the condition, that might make you select a multiple baseline design, since you typically need more measurement occasions when there is data instability. All right, so we've talked about the 3 basic condition ordering types and the most common types of single case design. The next presentation for day 1 will build on this information and discuss some additional design types and how to choose designs. And also in that presentation, at the end, there will be a QR code, which will allow you to use a Google form to ask me questions. And so if you have questions about this presentation, feel free to submit them at that point.